verse 1 all the way to chapter 6 and verse 8. And let's remember now as we turn to God's Word that this is indeed what I've just described it as. This is God's Word. This is God speaking to us. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he created them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Kenan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. After he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, and he said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." After Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, we thank God for his precious word. Death is something, naturally, that none of us want to face. None of us want to face death, and yet some are willing to go to extreme lengths in order to avoid death. I don't know if you've heard of a company called Alcor. They're in Arizona in the States. And Alcor are offering people a very particular and very peculiar service. You see, Alcor, for the small fee of just $80,000 for your head or $200,000 for your entire body, will, just after you die, will freeze in liquid nitrogen your whole body. And they hope that one day science will have progressed enough and human beings will have the ability to revive you and, of course, then cure whatever it was that killed you. And by the way, if you just go for the $80,000 package, they're also going to have to figure out how to get your body back as well. Perhaps we balk at the idea of preserving our body in frozen state. But no matter whether we are going to extreme lengths, like those who are employing Alcor services, we're all, at some level, trying to stave off death, aren't we? We're all trying to stave off death in some way, whether we're keeping fit and active, trying to keep our bodies in good shape, whether we're taking vitamin supplements, whether we're controlling our diet, eating certain things and not other things. All of us, in some way, we're trying to delay death for as long as possible. None of us wants to dwell on it, and rightly so. But the bottom line is, no matter what, death is coming. And death is awful. Death is tragedy. It's separation from the ones we love. It's that sudden and tragic end to our lives. And no amount of nice platitudes that we might write on a card or say at a funeral, none of those will take away the fact of the cold hard truth that death is the end. It's awful. So the question we might want to ask this morning then is, what hope is there in the face of death? What hope is there in the face of death? Well, we're going to think about that, especially from Genesis chapter 5 and on into chapter 6. And three things in particular I'd like us to see from this passage. First of all, we'll see the reign of death. Second of all, the reality of judgment. And third of all, the reverse of the curse. So let's first of all think about the reign of death. So just to go back over what we've seen so far, the story so far in Genesis, we saw in chapters 1 and 2 that God makes this beautiful world. He makes it perfect. He declares it all to be good. And then he makes humanity, he makes us, men and women, in his image. And then he gives us this beautiful garden for us to enjoy, the Garden of Eden. But then, of course, Satan, through the snake, tempts the man and the woman, and sin enters the world, and the curse duly follows. In chapter 4, we saw last time that things go into a downward spiral as things go from bad to worse. From Adam and Eve having eaten of a forbidden fruit, their offspring, Cain, kills his brother. And Cain's offspring show no hope of any promise there either, with Lamech just boasting in arrogance at his own murderous vengeance. But we came to the end of chapter 4 and we saw that there was hope through this man, this boy who was born, Seth. After the double tragedy that Eve faced of having her son Abel killed and then Cain exiled under curse by God, Eve continues to express her hope in God's promise that one day, as God promised in chapter 3 verse 15, he was going to send the snake crusher, the promised offspring, descendant, who was going to come and defeat Satan. And now we come to chapter 5 and we're into another family tree. Another one of these genealogies, and it's an important family tree that bridges for us between Seth and Noah, and we're going to hear the Noah story from next week on. But this genealogy is bridging these two stories and the many centuries that lay between this time period. And it begins with a very important restatement in verse 1. It's something we've heard before, but it's very important that we hear it again here. Have a look again at verse 1. And God says that when God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He made them in the likeness of God. Now, when you think of that word likeness, if we've been reading the story so far, we should get a flashback to what we heard in chapter 1, that God made mankind, men and women, in his image, in his likeness. So we know that God made people in his image. But in case that we thought the curse in some way, that we read about in chapter 3, in some way got rid of the image of God, it's restated for us here. Mankind still made in God's image. It follows through the descendants, people still made in God's image. We're still filled with dignity and value and worth coursing through our veins. We're made in the image of God. And it's stated again here in verse 1, but note in verse 3 that we see that it said, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in, notice this word, in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. So the point is that it's passing from Adam to his son and to the generation to today. Mankind, despite the curse, despite our waywardness, we're still made in God's image. We're still valuable and precious to him. And what a relief that is to hear after the awful things that we heard of in chapter 4. Do you remember the utter cheek of Cain? The way that he spoke to God? The way that sin just got a grip on his life? And we thought about his descendant Lamech and his vengeance. Well, God has not given up on us people yet. We're still made in his image. But of course that doesn't mean that all is rosy, does it? I mean, chapter 5, if anything else, the rest of this genealogy, I hope that you picked up that it shows us, that at least one thing it shows us very clearly, that the snake was lying in the garden. When the snake said to Eve as part of his temptation, "You will not certainly die," clearly contradicting what God had said, that if they'd eaten of this fruit, they would certainly die. The snake was lying. God was telling the truth. Death came as a result of sin. Take Adam, for example. There's this repeated refrain that goes through and through. You have a look at verses 4 to 5 with Adam, but it happens with all the descendants after. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. This refrain running through the whole way. They live, they have children, then they die. And what is it that's ringing in our ears as we go through chapter 5? It's death. 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 Death may not have come immediately, but death came. As Paul put it in Romans chapter 5, death reigned from the time of Adam. Death reigned from the time of Adam's sin, and death is the consequence of sin. As Paul writes again in Romans 6, the wages of sin is death. Death is what we earn as a result of our sinful rebellion against God. It's the wages of sin. In the next section, we're going to see just how serious sin is to God. But meantime, you may have a question. I had it when I was reading this. We certainly hear of death, but before death comes, people seem to live a very long period of time, don't they? A very long period of time. How can they live so long? I mean, Adam, verse 5, we read about, we can see a little timeline there, I think. Adam lived to like 930 years. Actually, that's to see in a second. Adam, he lives 930 years. His son Seth, 912 years. Per Mahalalel, if I think that's how you pronounce his name. He just missed his 900th birthday. Daddy young fella, huh? Question, how could they live so long compared to us? Well, I think the best explanation is, there's a couple, but I think the best is to see a more gradual effect of the curse on human lifespan. To see a more gradual effect of the curse on human lifespan. I don't think it's that when the curse came, death came immediately. That's clear, it didn't come immediately to Adam or to Eve. But there seems to be a delay even compared to our lifespans today, from immortality to mortality. Because notice what God said in chapter 6 and verse 3 in response to increasing human wickedness on the earth. Chapter 6 and verse 3, Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. Their days will be 120 years. So God seems to put a limit here on the length of human lifespan, top 120 years. Now, after this statement, we don't see 120 years as the limit immediately, but we do see throughout the pages of Genesis and indeed throughout the rest of the Old Testament a gradual decrease in human lifespan. So the next guy we hear about is Noah. Noah lives 950 years. His son Shem, 500 years. On then into the line of Noah and Shem, Arphaxad, 403 years. Then we go on in Genesis, we find out about Abraham, lived 175 years, until we get to one of the last main characters at the end of Genesis. Joseph lives 110 years as this 120 cap seems to kick in. Do you see how this decreasing human lifespan doesn't seem to happen immediately? It happens gradually over time as we come from being immortal to being mortal. But the bottom line is this: whether we live for 9 centuries or whether we don't even make 1 century, the bottom line is we all die. We all die. I think like most young people, whenever I was growing up, I didn't really have much heed of death. It just didn't really register with me. And that was until last year at school, and one of my school friends died in a motorbike crash. He was just 18 years old as I was. And I'll never forget arriving at the funeral of my 18-year-old school friend. And it was awful. He had only one sister, and she arrived with her family, and she was wailing. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody wail before. It is awful. The only way that she could express her grief was to scream at the top of her lungs. They could barely keep her there for the funeral. She was so loud. Her grief was just unimaginable as she screamed out and cried out. And as a young 18-year-old lad, it was a rude awakening for me about the reality of death. And that's what we're hearing about in Genesis chapter 5. It's a wake-up call. Death has come. And it comes to everybody in this family line, no matter how old that they might have lived to. But then as we come into chapter 6, things really do start to intensify. So we see, second of all, the reality of judgment. Now, I got no relief when I heard this week, and I read this week from one of the commentators, that Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 to 4 are unquestionably the hardest verses in all of Genesis to interpret. Whew, that would give me no small relief, because I struggled with these verses, and you'll see why in just a second. The main issue is, how do we understand who these sons of God and daughters of human are? Who are these people? Let's think about them from chapter 6. Let's read verses 1 to 2 and then verse 4. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them that they chose. Then down to verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So who are these sons of God? It's a puzzling question for us. Well, there's 3 main views. I'm going to outline them for us, and you'll see them pop up on the screen there. The first view is that the sons of God were angels. They were angels, those who defied God and went outside of their appointed realm and married human women. And so these Nephilim that we read in verse 4, then, they were the product of unnatural sexual relations. So the first view is that the sons of God were angels. The second view is that the sons of God were Sethites. They were descendants of Seth. And so the sons of God were those who are descended from Seth and who wrongfully married those descendants from Cain. So those 2 family trees that we saw, the family tree of Cain that we saw last time at the end of chapter 4, and now we're pointed into this family tree of Seth. And so some people would say that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, who were marrying then the daughters of mankind, the daughters who had descended from Cain. That's another view. The third view is that the sons of God were human rulers, those who held positions of authority on the earth and saw themselves as divine. So perhaps there were those who were on the earth, not perhaps, it's known that there were those who were on the earth in those days who had positions of authority, and some people worshipped them as gods. And so they saw themselves as divine human rulers, in that sense, sons of God. I think it's important before we get into this that no matter what view you take on who the sons of God are, it doesn't affect the overall message of the passage, which we're going to come to. We should not find ourselves falling out about who the sons of God were. Now, I'm going to tentatively suggest to you this morning that view 3 is the most appealing in my opinion, but I want to stress on the tentatively part of that. I want to tentatively suggest to you, we're not going to fall out over this if you think differently. Let me explain why I think view 3 is the most appealing. First of all, on the view that angels were the sons of God, I find that problematic for a few reasons. The first of all is that there's no suggestion in the Bible that angels have the ability to procreate, that angels have the ability to have sex. Angels are spiritual beings. They aren't made of the same stuff as us. And in fact, in Matthew 22, you'll read Jesus make a comparison between human marriage and how it is in heaven. And he says that in heaven we'll be like angels who neither marry nor are given in marriage. Angels, as far as I can see, aren't physically able to produce offspring. So I find it troubling, the view that the sons of God were angels. So that's the idea that they were angels. Second of all, the sons of God, that they're descendants of Seth. And that the daughters of men then are the descendants of Cain. Now, I think there's stronger argument for this one. Especially since later on in the Bible, God specifically commands that his people not marry other people from other nations. But I think, though that's slightly more appealing, this view, it's important to remember at this stage, God has not given such a command. It doesn't come until Leviticus and to Exodus. No such command existed. And so without the direct command of God, it seems strange that God would respond so strongly to the actions of the sons of God, that we're going to see that judgment in just a second. And also, it doesn't seem to explain the very well, this seems to be well-known renown of these Nephilim. I just don't see how, if they were descendants of Seth, the sons of God, how these Nephilim would have such renown. So that's the first two views. The third one, I think, is the most appealing. Again, we're not going to fall out over this. I'm just explaining how I've come to this conclusion. That they're human rulers. And I think it makes the best sense of both the text and of the culture at the time. Whenever you consider that people then, and still in some cultures today, that they would worship their leaders and their rulers as divine, as though they're like gods. Well, that seems to make sense here, that these rulers were happy to take on this title, the sons of God, and that they were happy to receive the worship of people. And so these Nephilim, who seem to be their offspring, they're falsely renowned for having these godlike powers in their genes. So that's my tentative suggestion. But again, it's important, no matter what view you take here, that that's not the main thing that we're supposed to learn from this passage. The main thing that we're supposed to see is that the sons of God were created beings who had sinned. The sons of God were created beings who had sinned. And we can see that especially in the language that is used in verse 2. Have a look again at verse 2. Pick up some of these words. See if it rings any bells in your ears. The sons of God saw that the daughters of human were beautiful, and they married, literally took as wives, took any of them they chose. The sons of God saw the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took as wives any of them as they chose. Does that ring any bells for you? Remember what language was used of Eve in the garden? She saw the fruit. She saw that it was good, comparative with beautiful, and she took that fruit. You see what we're being told here? The same evil that was causing Eve to take of that fruit and to disobey God is the same evil that's at work in the sons of God here. They are sinning. And in direct response, God puts a limit on their lifespan in verse 3, on human lifespan total. giving us just 120 years. I think it's important also to say that I think the sons of God are sinning sexually too. That they are sinning by taking as wives any that they choose. I think they're indulging their sexual appetites and indulging their sexual desires. And that is why God comes in such a harsh, not a harsh, but a fair and direct response to them in verse 3 by putting this limit on human lifespan. But worse is to come. Worse is to come, because it's not just the sons of God who are sinning here. Verse 5 is universally damning for all of us. Verse 5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This is awful. Humanity has gone into a complete tailspin. There really couldn't be a stronger way for God to put this to us. It's not some inclination, it's every inclination. It's not a little evil, it's only evil. It's not occasionally, it's all of the time. God reveals to us through His Word that when you get to the bottom of the human heart, what do you find? According to God, who sees right through us, you find evil. Evil. Sin has spread faster than coronavirus on the earth, and it has infected everyone. And there is no vaccine or cure for this global pandemic. This is tragedy. Think about what God saw when He looked at creation in chapter 1. He saw that it was good. And now God, when He sees us, when He saw us, what does He see? He sees that we are evil. Verse 5. The heart was only evil all the time. And by the way, this gives God no delight to see this in us. Have a look at His response in verse 6. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and His heart was deeply troubled. Again, He couldn't put it more strongly. He uses that word regret. Regret. There's a tension created with this word, because obviously God doesn't change His mind. He's not like us. He foresaw that all this would happen, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't feel strongly about this and deeply about this. And that word regret conveys His grief. His heart was deeply troubled when He saw the evil that had become of His good creation. It's not an exaggeration to say that God's heart broke when He saw what we had become. Things have gotten completely out of control, and therefore God must act, and so He does in verse 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. God is preparing to press the reset button on His creation, and it's going to be devastating. He's going to wipe out humanity and every living thing on the face of the earth. And we're going to see what that looks like next time. But for now, it's clear that God is not indifferent to sin, is He? He's not indifferent to sin. He's clearly deeply moved and troubled and must take drastic measures to deal with it. Judgment is coming. And by the way, God's reaction to sin here will make no sense to us unless we understand His relationship to us. I think it's helpful for us to think of it like the difference between, the difference between someone who's a stop and chat type of person on the street and someone who's not a stop and chat person on the street. So, you'd be going past someone. Sometimes it's fairly obvious whether it's someone who's just a, hello, how are you? Keep on going. Or is this person someone that you know well enough who's a stop and chat? Someone you're going to have to stop and catch up with and say a little bit more than just, how are you? The difference between a stop and chat and not a stop and chat type person. And sometimes we can be tempted, or sometimes in the world we can think of God as someone who's maybe not a stop and chat. He's a how are you kind of a person. And that's our relationship and God's relationship to us, that kind of somebody that we are familiar with, someone that we know, but not necessarily someone that we've got a particularly good relationship with. But that's not how it is with God, is it? You see, God's relationship with his creatures, with his people, is something much more akin to marriage. I mean, think of that relationship in marriage. If a husband cheats on a wife, or if a wife cheats on her husband, what way will their spouse react? Will they be happy about that? Will they be content? No, they will be angry, and justifiably so. Their trust has been broken. The relationship has been damaged, and they're hurt. And if they weren't angry, if they weren't hurt, it would show that they never really loved that person in the first place at all. God's love is strong, and sin is the breaking of that relationship. And sin has got so out of hand in the world that he is rightly outraged by it, and he must act in judgment. Sin is awful. Sin is ugly. Sin grieves God. And we'll see to the extent in which it grieves God next time when we think about the flood. Well, it's been pretty gloomy so far today, hasn't it? Pretty gloomy passage, thinking about sin. We saw the reign of death. We saw the reality of judgment. But despite all of that we see in this passage, we get a wonderful glimpse of hope. A wonderful break in this family tree of death. 3, the reverse of the curse. See, in chapter 5, we couldn't miss the fact that death comes to us all, except one very notable exception. Did you notice as we made our way through? Let's have a look again at chapter 5 and verses 21 to 24. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. Now there's a break in the pattern, right? What happened to death coming after they live and they do some things and then they die? Not Enoch. He doesn't die. He is taken away by God. He's a dazzling exception to this rule of death. And it's a very rare example of someone in the Bible who God decided to take straight to heaven. Elijah is the only other example I can think of in the Bible of someone who that God did this for. And really there's a couple of things that we should learn from this. First of all, God is able to reverse the curse. God is able to undo death. He's able to undo the effects of sin, and death being the wages of sin. He's able to undo that. Yes, the world is under a curse. Yes, sin has run rampant in our world. And yes, the wages of sin is death. But God is showing us through Enoch that he is well able to undo that curse. Second of all, it shows us God does this in response to Enoch's faith. Have a look again at verse 24. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Enoch's life was marked by confident trust in God. Now that doesn't mean that Enoch was perfect, but it does mean that he sought to live a life that pleased God. Of course, the New Testament is the best commentary always on the Old Testament. And listen to what the writer to the Hebrews says in chapter 11, verse 5. We'll throw it up on the screen. He says that by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Now notice what the writer says there. It was, by faith that Enoch was taken from this life. By faith. That means that Enoch trusted God. Enoch loved God and sought to please God. In short, as Genesis puts it, he walked with God. Enoch then is this standout example for us of how, for those who put their faith in God, he can reverse the curse. He can undo death for those that believe in him. And so we might think it's nice to see that God can reverse the curse of death. But in reality, he only did it for these two men in the Bible, Enoch and Elijah. What about me? How is that any help to me when I face my own death? How is that any help whenever I face the death of a loved one? I feel their loss. I feel the sting of death. We see it's so important for us to remember that what God did through Enoch is only a tiny taster, a tiny display of his grand ability to reverse the curse. Because Enoch points us to another man, doesn't he? Enoch points us to a greater man who walked faithfully with God. Enoch points us to Jesus. Jesus, who didn't leapfrog past death or bypass it. Jesus went one better. Jesus went and faced death, faced his own death. He walked faithfully with God, and then he died. And he died the worst way that we could even imagine. Through the crucifixion. The jaws of the grave swallowed him up just like everyone else, just like us all, except with one major difference. Jesus burst through the grave to the other side. He rose again victorious, having defeated death. Jesus is God's answer to the curse of death. Jesus is how we can reverse the curse. There was a man and a son driving down the road, and as the man and the son were driving down the road, the windows were open, it was a hot day, and a bee buzzed into the car. The little boy started to panic because this boy was allergic to bee stings, and one single bee sting could be lights out for him. The bee was buzzing around the car. The little boy was going crazy until the dad saw what was happening, reached out his hand, grabbed the bee and closed his hand. The boy calmed for a minute until his father released his hand again, and the bee started to buzz around the car. The boy is going crazy. He's panicking because of this bee and the fact that it could mean death for him, until his dad reassured him by telling him, "Son, look at my hand." The son looked at his hand, and there, that little barb in his father's hand, the father had taken the sting of the bee. "Son," he said, "I've taken that sting. The bee, it might sting you, but it can't harm you. It has lost its sting." And you see, Jesus, just like that dad, has taken the sting of death for us on the cross. Jesus has reversed the curse. For all of us that put our faith in Jesus, his death becomes our death, and his new life becomes our new life. And so for us, death is no longer the full stop it once was. Death has become a comma. All of us who trust in Jesus will come through the other side of death into life, into real life, eternal life. Death is not the end. And my goodness, doesn't that change everything about our lives right now? This God who has reversed the curse for us has invited us to walk with him. For those of us that have put our faith and trust in Jesus, that his death was our death and his new life is our new life, we've been called to walk with God. So as we finish, there's three things I think that walking with God really means. Three things. I think it's about affection, direction, and confession. It's more than this, but I think this summarizes it for us a little bit as we finish. Affection. Walking with God means we actually like God. Think about it. We actually like God. I mean, think of going for a walk with someone that you don't particularly enjoy their company. It's not a very pleasant thought, is it? an awkward stroll down the road. But that we walk with God means that we actually enjoy his company. We enjoy his company. We listen to him as he speaks to us through the Bible. And then we get to speak to him as we pray to him and respond to what we read in his words. It's not about religious duty. It's not about dry and dusty obedience. We do that because we love him. We enjoy being with him, and we want to express our appreciation of him and our delight in him. It affects our affections. We enjoy God. Walking with God, it's about our affections. It's also about our direction. We're walking with God. Think of how we start the Christian life. We start the Christian life by taking a U-turn, don't we? We were heading in this direction, this broad road that Jesus talked about that leads to destruction, going our own way, away from God. But then when God, by his Spirit, got a hold of our hearts, we repented. We did a U-turn. We turned around. We started walking God's way, started walking that narrow road that leads to life that Jesus spoke of. And the way in the Christian life is the way on. That means that the choices that we make, the things that we do, they aren't without reference to God. We do things according to God's way now. We walk with him, not with the world. Our affection, our direction, and with confession. Walking with God means that we don't enjoy sin anymore. We shouldn't enjoy the things that God hates. We saw in the passage just God's strong reaction against sin. And as Christians, as those who love God, we wouldn't want to do the things that God hates, would we? Just in the same way, if you love someone and you know that they enjoy classical music, say, when they get into your car, you're not going to stick on the death metal CD, are you? And pump out the tunes because you love them and you appreciate them and you want to do what pleases them. And so it is with God. We hate the things that he hates and we love the things that he loves. Sin grieves God to his heart. And whenever we stumble into sin, as we all do, it's not something that we should be happy about. It's something that we repent of. We confess it to him, knowing that he forgives us, knowing that he welcomes us to continue in this relationship of loving forgiveness that we're in with him. Walking with God means our affection, our direction, and our confession. It means more than that, but I think that's a helpful summary of some of the things it means to walk with God. So as we close this morning, let's remember, Enoch walked with God and he didn't taste death, but Jesus went one better. Jesus walked with God and he did taste death, but he broke through death to the other side victorious. So let's today see the great love of our God for us and seek to walk with him in love too. Amen. Amen. We're going to sing